Project Zomboid, a game where you cosplay as the average citizen of Ohio. But Hedgie, you might be saying. That clearly says Kentucky, not Ohio. No, that says Ohio. You're just reading it wrong. You must be dyslexic or something. Now, I recently got this game, seeing plenty of people play it on YouTube, and I assumed, because of how well those people did, that it'd be a pretty easy game. But boy, could I not be more wrong. I died plenty of times in those first few playthroughs. Eventually, I just decided to do the unthinkable. I removed the zombies from Project Zomboid. Now, I know what you might be saying, but Hedgie, where's the fun in that? The whole point is to pose a challenge in order for you to die. That's how the game starts out, with saying, this is how you died. Well, in order to actually, challenge myself, at least in the slightest bit, I decided to turn down the weather to very cold and set myself in the middle of January, the coldest month. Now, whenever I first did this, I survived a few days, and then I said, you know what, why don't I make this a video? Now, whenever I first got this idea, I thought you could turn down the amount of time where you still have available electricity and water. I was going to turn that off, and essentially had to survive purely off of scavenging, because farming would be unrealistic. I was wrong. I originally also intended to set myself in February, just survive for a month and I could start farming, have a little bit of fun in the game. It is, after all, just a game. But after I discovered that you in fact cannot turn off, within a 2-week span, which is what I was planning to do, all of the different utilities, I said, fuck it, we're going to January, and then I started up a new game with absolutely zero experience, and my intention is to survive for 2 whole months, based purely off of scavenging supplies, and hopefully become the perfect person and max out all of my skills, and perhaps also build myself a house rather than simply live in one. This is my journey. I started in a generic 2-story house with nothing but the clothes on my back. My first goal was to find a place I could call home while I gathered the skills and materials necessary to be able to build myself a house. In the starter home, I only found a few books, magazines, and some warmer clothes in order to help battle the winter cold. Now, I'm going to be completely honest, I kind of improvised this whole thing, seeing as how I didn't have much of a plan in the very beginning. I made it up as I went along, but whenever I left the house, I figured that my first goal was to find a car, a working car, so that I can gather supplies from further and be able to carry more stuff around. Now, I managed to get lucky, and around a day later, I found a car, a working car, that had keys. Only issue is, didn't have any gas. And, unfortunately for me, neither did any of the cars around it. So I spent the next day looking for a car with gas, and I managed to find a wreck which had a car with a full tank of gas. It was around this point that it had finally started to snow, and I realized that my travels would get a lot harder, considering that now the wind was getting a lot colder, and I could no longer see the road, meaning that whenever I drive, I have to spend a lot of my time looking on the map just to make sure I don't drive off the road. At some point during my travels, I managed to find a map of a town located next to a river. I figured this town would be a perfect place to set up in, considering that the river that it was located next to would be a great spot to fish and have a decent supply of water, which I could then boil to drink, wash my clothes, wash myself, and just do the normal things you do with water. So I decided to waste no time and start my journey. While on the road, I came up with a second goal: find a trauma bag. I figured that because I'm not a good driver, it would be very important for me to have something to heal myself with in the case I get into a car accident at any point in time. Now, I'm going to spoil this a little bit. I was unsuccessful in finding a trauma bag, even though there were plenty of car wreck pileups on my travels. All of the ambulances that I searched were either completely broken down or were locked. Now, I had also hoped to find myself a bigger car than the one that I already had, just so that I can carry more supplies back and forth once I do decide to settle down and build myself the house. However, once again, I was unsuccessful, and I had to stay with the Park Ranger vehicle, which by no means is bad. It's a great vehicle, lots of cargo space, but I would prefer something better. Considering this is a post-apocalyptic survival game, I was grateful even for the car that I got. On my path to the Promised Land, I came across a clothing shop, which, unfortunately for me, had no warm clothes, or at the very least no clothes warmer than what I already had except for a leather jacket, which I promptly wore. At this point, I had already lost track of the days. All I knew was that I had a month before all the utilities were to turn off. However, what I found rather interesting was that I was no longer able to regenerate water in sinks. So, for example, if a sink only has 20 water available, I was unable to wash all my clothes, which I found rather interesting considering that they weren't supposed to cut water yet. But alas, it did not bother me, seeing as how I was on the road and I didn't have time to use up all of the water in an area. However, I figured that would be a problem that I would later have to face. Back on the road again, I came across an old gas station, which I took all of its candy from and other foods and put it in my passenger seat in order to eat while driving, and it's always good to have a supply of non-perishable goods such as candy. Sooner or later, I had done it. I had arrived at the promised land with one final obstacle. There were roadblocks blocking the entrance of the city. When I had arrived to those roadblocks, it was already very late and I was getting really tired, so I decided to take a few steps back into a residential area that I saw on my way not too far from those roadblocks. On the next day, I decided to take a bit of a different route. On my way there, I noticed there were railroad tracks heading towards the city. I decided to take them just to see where that gets me. Now, unfortunate for me, those road tracks did not reach the city. Now, I could be wrong there because I didn't follow them all the way. Whenever I came up with the first railway station, I decided that that was my stop, and I decided I will try and enter the city from a different angle, because there was no wire fence where I decided to stop at. Or at least so I thought. After traveling a few meters away from the railroad tracks, I noticed that those wire fences were in fact there, so I decided to take my car alongside the fence. Now that path led me into a forest which I assumed I could traverse in the car. And while being correct, it was very difficult. I managed to find a hole in the wire fence, which I knew I could get my car through. However, I struggled there for a good few minutes, trying to place the car into a way where it would, in fact, be able to get through. Eventually, I had done it. I got through the wire fence and made my way to a nearby campsite, which was literally about 20 meters from the fence. And it was at that moment that I knew I had made it into the promised land. I was very close until reaching a shelter, and I was therefore really close to actually starting on my goals, which I had set myself in the beginning of the run. However, before I entered the town proper, I came across an old hospital, which I used to scavenge for some medical supplies and hopefully try and find myself a trauma bag. I was unsuccessful in finding the trauma bag, however, I was able to find myself a good bit of healing supplies. After I looted the hospital, I opened up the map and looked at which house looked like it could be viable to sustain my being. I marked it on the map, and I made my way straight for it. Once I arrived, I noticed that the house was a lot bigger than I initially anticipated. It was also full of storage, which would come very handy in the long run considering I was going to start hoarding food, building supplies, and medical supplies. Once I got inside the house, I redistributed all of the supplies from the car and my bag into cupboards, refrigerators, and wherever else they went, and had a good night's sleep. The next day, I decided to work on myself a little bit. I studied some books, watched TV, read some magazines, and most importantly discovered that you can in fact boil river water in a stove. I'm going to be honest, I did not know that in the beginning of the run. As I said, this is my first time playing. However, I soon discovered that the house that I lived in does not have a microwave in order for me to be able to boil water in water bottles. So that was a bit of an issue, but I thought I could fix it by simply finding one another house and just bringing it over to my house. So that's what I did the day after. I went outside and began looting the nearby houses. The first house I went to had a microwave. However, as I once again quickly discovered, I was unable to pick up said microwave, and therefore I was unable to drag it back into my house in order to hoard it like I normally would. But alas, that did not discourage me in the slightest, seeing as how I still had a stove and a kettle, so I figured I should rather focus on finding more kettles rather than finding microwaves. The first house I looted also had a full trash bag's worth of canned goods and other types of food, which I stocked myself up, and I figured I could survive off of it for a week or two, but that didn't stop me from scavenging for food later. I also looked in the garage of that house in order to find myself building supplies, and I found quite a bit of sheet metal and other types of welding supplies. The day after, I spent mainly organizing my stuff that I had gathered in the previous day, and after that, I decided to take my car and park it up in the neighborhood nearby in order to be able to actually carry some of the heavier stuff, and once again bring it back into my house for later use. At some point after that, I heard a helicopter flying above my house. At first I was a little bit confused about it, but then I remembered what I once read in a wiki article about this game, because I do a little bit of research on a game before I start it. That was a random event, which normally is supposed to lead a lot of zombies in your direction if you're not inside of a house. Now, seeing as how there were no zombies, the helicopter posed no threat to me. However, I did remember the fact that you could hear about those things, those events, such as the helicopter, on the radio, if you tune into the right channel. I also remembered that I could look at the weather forecast for the next day and for this day. So that's what I did. I found myself a radio, and I tuned into the broadcast, almost while reading and watching TV, just working on myself. It was about at this point that I'd realized that I'd finally made myself a home, and I knew that I'd be able to survive in this home for a good long time, and so I decided to end the episode there, with me just staring off into the distance.